We're delighted to have Emma Curtis with us, who runs her own strategic communications company, to talk about how data is used and in sales and marketing and transformation and all sorts of interesting things that we didn't know. So hopefully you'll enjoy this as much as we did. Welcome back to the Connected podcast. This is season 14. We're already into episode 5. We're delighted to have Emma Curtis with us today. Emma is the founder and CEO of our own strategic communication company. And as we said in our first podcast, we're really interested in talking about data in different ways of how it's used, not just talking about the technical ways that we manage it and that we think of it in terms of data governance. So we've asked Emma to come along today and talk about kind of sales and marketing use of data, strategic comms, the way data is used, how it's trusted, how it's used, and maybe get a better view of good ways and bad ways when you're trying to get people to be interested in data. So that's kind of one of our biggest challenges, and we're hoping Emma can give us some good insights. So Emma, thanks for joining us today. Do you want to give us a little bit of your own background before we get started?
Yeah, sure. And thank you for inviting me onto the podcast. So I think my background is varied. For the last 30 years, I've come from a design background, but always fundamentally understanding the importance of data that sits behind everything we do in our industry. And I think for the last 20 years, I've been basically parachuted into organizations to help support with a lot of different transformation opportunities. When I say transformation, it goes from anything through from sales and marketing activity all the way through to organizational change, with organizations responding to whatever's happening in their market. So whether that's M&A, acquisition, all the way through to their brand's not working very well and it's not communicating with the end user. Ultimately, everything we do is underpinned by data and understanding what is going on behind the scenes so we can then plan and react to that accordingly.
I mean, I think it's often something that kind of gets lost. I think if it's going well, people don't see it. If it's not going well, they definitely do see it. But if we can start on the sales and marketing side, certainly I get confused, and I know some of our people we work with get confused when we talk about data for sales and marketing. And kind of I think there's two versions of that. Can you help out our listeners with a kind of a good explanation of what do we mean when we talk about data for sales and marketing?
So basically, if you're a sales team, you need to understand your figures, you have targets that you need to meet. So you've got the sales side of the business is all about talking to the customers, mapping the conversations you're having with the customers, mapping any new products coming out of an organization and understanding the benefits so you can actually sell that on to the customers. That's all, again, underpinned by data. So from a sales perspective, if I'm talking to a customer, customers are always at different, as we call it, stages of the buyer journey. So, and as consumers will understand that. So you're thinking about buying something, so you're doing a huge amount of research. So marketing will help the sales team by giving them the data they need to actually, whether it's on the website or if it's downloadable PDFs, that sort of stuff. So as a buyer, you'll actually start to do your research. You'll then lock in. You could have a particular brand that you are really happy and confident with. So you could, be researching product within that brand. And then from a sales perspective, dependent on and this is where data comes in. So dependent on the user, how they are basically interacting with your brand and your sales material, you can figure out whether they're a cold prospect, so they're just doing a little bit of research, whether they've made a decision, they're just trying to figure out price point and what brand to go after for a particular product. So at that point, they're a warmer prospect. And then the sales team can then get in there and try and have more of a conversation with them, depending on what the product or the brand is. But if I'm buying a product and I've done my research and I want to know more, I'll probably get onto the website, download a PDF. And at that point, I'm a fairly hot prospect in terms of I've got to that point where I'm engaging, I want to learn more, and the sales team can then come in. Ultimately, all of that is mapped in the background and from a data perspective, and it's managed, and it can be managed well or it can be managed horrifically. So, you have organizations that have CRMs in place, so they're very, very They've got a pathway that they're understanding exactly where the customers are, and the sales team have access to that and then can ring up and say, okay, well, we dropped an email on this customer 2 weeks ago. They did click it. They've engaged with it. It would be worth a conversation, or they've downloaded X. Where it's not managed very well, it goes into a vacuum. Nobody looks at it, understands it, and actually you then start to drop off leads because nobody's understanding what the customer's doing. So from a sales perspective, that's the sales data side of it. There's a whole host more, but
yeah, I mean, just a super quick one on that. I mean, just listening to that, reflecting on it, it's like how the world's changed since what, about the 1990s, because I guess it was all lagging indicators back in the day. What have people bought? Whereas now you kind of know almost before they do what they're going to buy. I mean, is that the biggest change, the volume, the timeliness of the data in the sales cycle? Is that, or is it the sophistication or the amount of data, or?
I think it's a touch point. So, and it's what data can tell you behind that buyer behaviors, but it's the multiple touch points, because digital has actually exploded so much. You've got so many different channels available that you can advertise or market across. So from the sales team, you have to track TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, website activity, email activities. It's multiple channels. But what you're finding is there's so much noise in the marketplace. And you, again, as consumers, we're bombarded daily. And it's not until you really want to think about or buy something, you then start to see ads start to track you across different channels. Because, and also if you're talking about it, things are listening, so you suddenly get ads popping up. But it does mean that we're all a little bit more immune to it. So rather than actually just picking a magazine up in the 80s or whatever and actually going, oh, actually I really like the look of that, I'm going to say mountain bikes because we all mountain bike. Nowadays you have to hit people in multiple channels, and I can't remember what the stat is, but it's a huge amount before actually it registers, because there's just so much noise.
Yeah, well, we're going to talk about metrics later, hopefully, but well, anyway, I've talked too much. You got a question?
Yeah, so I was thinking about where you were describing how some of this can go wrong from a sales and marketing perspective, but you also talked when you introduced yourself about you having lots of kind of involvement in big strategic transformation processes within businesses. And how does that, what you've experienced with the sales and marketing use of data, how does that translate into some of the good and bad practices where that's being used for major change?
So when a business is going through, I always think about organizations as a living, breathing entity, because we're all people and we come together and we create an organization. So we're an entity and we evolve or we don't evolve. So organizational change is where an organization is responding to something that's happening, whether that's rapid growth, whether it's needing to respond to a disruptive competitor in the market, whether it's growth through acquisition. There's a huge amount of stuff in there, but ultimately from a data perspective, there is internal comms data, external comms data. So you look at things like if you're doing a massive organizational change, you've got to understand the employee data, or you've got to understand through an acquisition, there is a lot of data, business data that you need to understand. So we use data in multiple ways, but ultimately, if you're doing a change program and the data isn't right, or you don't trust the data, how as a leadership team can you actually make really solid decisions if the data is not, you're not 100% sure on it? So if you have a meeting in HR, for example, and other functions are coming to the meeting and all the data there's a disconnect and they're not, it's a little bit disparate. It's very, very difficult from a strategic perspective to go, right, we're going that way because actually I don't trust my data. So I don't trust the figures. I don't trust our people data. There's a whole raft of things. Or if I want to, we're growing the business. So from a sales perspective, I need the data to be able to, in the figures, to know where we're going, because I need to then plan the business from an employee headcount and what we need. Do we need additional people in the marketing team? Do we need new sales, people in sales? If I don't trust my data from the sales team or from, then how do I business plan? So ultimately, I think that's where we see that.
So it's really interesting hearing that take from you, Emma, because our experience generally within the higher education sector is that regardless of the level of change, there doesn't seem to be that same appreciation around the value of trusted, defined data that really helps decision making and drive an organization forward. It really feels like it's more of a reactive, we have to do this and this might be our evidence, rather than we need to have it up front and it needs to guide us through those decisions. In terms of the private sector where you work, do you have a feel, and I know that this isn't going to be the kind of the single kind of answer to everything, but in terms of the organizations you've engaged with, how much experience have you come across where organizations have been at that weaker end of the scale in terms of their data maturity, and therefore it's become much more challenging in making those changes?
I think because we deal with startups all the way through to very, very large FTSE, FTSE 100 companies. And so dependent on where they are, I think in their growth cycle, is probably the answer to where your data maturity piece sits. So if somebody's, a quick spin up entrepreneurial business, then their data is normally a little bit more disparate, because actually there's normally 2 to 3 people in the mix who are doing everything. So from HR all the way through to the sales and marketing and driving the business forward. Once that starts to then develop into the next step, so whether they've got more investment or whether actually the company's building quickly, that's when you can see the gaps in the data, because ultimately that's when they need to make those next step strategic pivots into where they're going. So and you can see when it doesn't work, you can see employee engagement drops massively. People don't feel comfortable in the organization because they're not sure where it's going, because if you've got a leadership team that don't trust their data to be able to grow the business, because it is all about data, so whether it's the sales, the finance, whatever, you need to have a leadership team that've got a really clear strategic roadmap in terms of where the company's going, how they then take the employees and the customers, so internal and external again. So that is a sort of data maturity. Not all of them, that's it's not a blanket statement, but that is more normally the case, because it's a fleet of foot, very agile, needs to just get stuff done, and then you're actually sort of on your proving ground, and then you're moving into more of a mature business. Where we see it, where it's been the very, very large corporates we work with are heavily regulated, they're reporting into a board, they're normally listed, so there's a huge amount of rigor around data, whether it's customer data all the way through to they are reporting into the markets. So that's where that shifts.
That's interesting, because
data.
HE is really regulated, and it feels like we're 15 years behind that. And we've always said it feels like 10 to 15 years, and this conversation is making me feel, it's 10 to 15 years still. In fact, I think that number just keeps going that way. I mean, I think probably brings me on to a broader question, which is so it's kind of a 2-part question, really. Is that one of the things that I'm very cynical, being a data person, as is Rav, when I see things advertised using numbers, and somebody says, we're 50% better than what, a sausage? I don't know what you're talking about. And so that lack of rigor around. I know there is regulation, but the way numbers are used, and data is used in marketing, I don't know. It must be successful because people continue to do it. I don't know whether you've got a view of whether that's getting better or getting worse, or how hard it is to sort of consolidate across the multiple channels you were talking about. But also, I think, do you see anything internally in the sectors that you work? Do you find people are asking for rigor around data, or do they just say, we're a good company, we know what we're doing, we trust the data, we don't need to get into the background? Because again, that question is kind of leading for us a little bit, because we get that a lot. We get a lot of people questioning methodologies and saying we don't agree with that. So we're just really interested. I'm really interested in that from a kind of AG point of view, but I'm really interested in the other one, because whenever I see that, it just makes my teeth itch, and I'm just wondering whether or not that's normal, or whether or not the way that sales and marketing is done, we're going to say we can make our product look good, whatever the numbers are.
I'm going to start from a marketing perspective. So I'm as cynical as you are, because I'm in the industry. So I will have a look at that. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting. There's like 50% off or 50% lower sugar. And then I always look at the very little caveat at the bottom, which is so your face wrinkle cream will make you wrinkleless in 6 weeks. Tried and tested with 2 people. So I'm always really cautious to look at the stats that sit behind it, and then make my mind up, because actually if it's a your wrinkles are going to disappear overnight, and we have tested this across 10,000 women, well, that's a fairly sizable test group. So you need to just be not cynical but aware, I think, and aware that marketing can polish polish figures, and it's really interesting. But from a internal organizational, ultimately we're always in to have a look at challenges the organization's facing, whether this is the growth thing or and we do need to be and trust and understand the data. So if it's a culture survey, for example, we're normally in there because we need to think about and work with the teams to adjust culture. So we need to know where everybody's at on the scale. So we trust the data. So we'll run a whether it's a poll or a culture survey or whatever, to get that raw data in from the employee base. And then we can then go through it, and then we will be very honest with the figures, because ultimately we want to tease out what's going on in the organization so that we can then start to incrementally put a roadmap in to start to move the culture, or start to work with the leaders to understand where the culture is and where we need to move it to get the organization to move forwards. Because ultimately you need to take your employee base with you. It's all about people. So data is used in so many different ways through and understanding that from us, from a consultancy, is really critically important. But from a marketing perspective, there is a little bit of, they can't go too far, because again, that is heavily regulated. So you'll see that if you're on whether it's TV or radio. I had to, a few years ago, go through a broadcasting training in terms of what you can and can't say in the stats, and it's all rigorously approved. So if you go and do a TV ad, you have to put it onto a platform, and it's heavily regulated in terms of it's got to be proven. You've got to send all the facts and stats in first, and it's got to be quantified, and then they will sign it off. So particularly things, if you think about, I've worked in medical, so if you think about we were working with a couple of very large medical brands, and you've got to be absolutely on the ball with the claim, whatever you're claiming, and that's super heavily regulated. So
that's interesting. Because I suppose data can be massaged to tell you anything that you need it to tell you, really, can't it? But
yes,
that level of rigor feels a step beyond what we have in higher education, don't you think, Alex?
It's not a step; it's run off. It's gone off over there. We're still here.
Yeah, it's the same thing, isn't it?
A like and went round the world while the truth puts its boots on. It does feel a long way from that. That's interesting. I didn't know that. I think we should. I think that the thing about data is, I always the way you're taught when you think about data is to say, if somebody puts data in front of you, it's who is this person and what is their agenda.
Yes.
Where did the data come from, and how do they source it, and what are they trying to tell you, and do those two things match up? And I think if you apply those 3 rules in life, it's actually a really good way to give yourself some confidence in what you're seeing, especially when you see things in lots of you see the same thing represented in lots of different ways, and it's like, which one is right? So
but then how does that all play into the fact that AI is really coming into the conversation now? How have you experienced the use of AI, especially in that space where it could go into promotional and marketing activity, but also in terms of how people within organizations are shifting how they work to adapt and to utilize AI?
So there's no doubt AI has shifted the creative advertising marketing industry massively. Absolutely, is a huge transformation piece that we're still going through, and people are still running to catch up and understand how to use it for their businesses. There's a whole governance piece to AI which is still missing, and it's being worked on at the moment, and you can see that starting to come through from the major AI platforms in terms of, and also the big corporates that are engaging with it and trying to understand how to put guardrails around it. So if people are using AI to within an organization, they need help and support in terms of what they can and can't do with it, particularly in some of the more sensitive organizations we work with. And what we're actually seeing is people are just finding their way through it a little bit. What I would say is that the people who are taking AI further quicker at the moment are using their expertise and knowledge to use it to amplify or enable and do things quicker. But there's always that human sense check at the end of it, and not just assuming that AI's got all the answers, because people are actually out there now cheating AI and cheating the stats. So AI will pick a stat up that's been planted by somebody intentionally. So it's only when you're at the end of it and you do your due diligence piece and go, right, actually, where have you got all of that from? Because I need to quantify where I've got this research from, show me the evidence. And then you actually really need to start to actually work with AI to be able to go out and get the evidence and then look at it and go, yeah, actually, that's an annual report, or it's a piece of market research that actually is very relevant for this. So it can be an absolute goldmine of information, but it needs that human sense check at the end of it. And then it's that human people piece that you need to apply, whether it's taking the bare bones of it and using it from a tone of voice perspective, but you've got the human element, which is us actually applying that and helping. But I wouldn't trust it implicitly, and there's a whole massive piece on governance that's still lacking at the moment.
Yeah, and we see that tone of voice thing, and we see things that people ask us to review that clearly just comes straight out of Claude or whatever, and people have made no effort, and it's really, in some ways it's great, in some ways it feels hard to know if it's going to be a good or a bad thing, or that it's going to stay with us. We're going to have to get you back, because we want to talk to you about how data people can make better cases about data, because we like to talk about data. That doesn't normally excite the people that we're trying to sell it to, but we've run out of time today. So first thing, I mean, thank you very much. Can you come back and talk about that for us?
Yeah, again? I'd love to.
We just, as ever, we've wandered off the point completely, and but we will get back to that. But thank you very much for your time today. Really appreciate it, and we'll catch up with you on the next podcast.
Love to, and it's been great fun. Thank you very much.
That was great. Thanks, Emma. We'd love to get Emma back, because we didn't ask her one of the questions that we really wanted to, and we think that'd be really interesting for this audience. As ever, we appreciate any feedback, whether you like this stuff. It was opening out the podcast a little bit. If you're finding it interesting, we have James Robson back on next week. We've asked James to come back to talk about some stuff, because he was a really interesting guest, and I expect it'll be even better the second time. So that'll be the next one that we'll be doing for episode 6.